So we're going to start talking about the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system. Sometimes people call this the circulatory system. I prefer the cardiovascular system. There are some differences. Sometimes the circulatory system is seen as just kind of the circulation of the blood within the cardiovascular system, as well as the lymphatic system along with it. So we're going to separate it out. We're going to talk about the cardiovascular system now and then the lymphatic system a little bit later in the semester. So when we look at the cardiovascular system, what we see here is that the word cardiovascular is actually split up into two pieces. So we have cardio and then we have vascular. And basically what that means, cardio is relating to the heart and vascular is relating to the vessels. And so what we're talking about is the heart, which is the pump part, the pump of the entire system, and then the blood vessels, which are like the tubes or the pipes. And so what we have is that we have the heart is pumping the blood, and then the blood is going through the blood vessels, allowing the blood to circulate to nearly all of the parts in the body. So this is the cardiovascular system composed of the heart, the vessels, and then also the blood, which is being pumped by the heart and being pushed through the vessels. So let's take a look at the cardiovascular system functions. So some of the functions of the cardiovascular system, first is to deliver oxygen. So we're talking about delivering oxygen to all of the tissues in the body. So we are going to be getting that oxygen from the lungs, and we'll take a look at how that happens, but we'll be getting the oxygen from the lungs as we breathe in the oxygen, and then we're going to be taking it to all of the other tissues of the system, or of the body. So delivering oxygen. Also, we're going to be delivering things like other nutrients. So when we are eating something, we're going to be breaking down that food and we're going to be delivering it all over the body in the blood, as the blood is part of the cardiovascular system. So things like glucose, for example, amino acids from our proteins, various fats that we're eating. So we're going to be bringing those throughout the body as well. So delivering oxygen, we can say delivering nutrients. Also, we're going to be bringing hormones. So transferring or bringing oxygen around the body, bringing nutrients around the body, and then also bringing hormones around the body. So some of the hormones, so for example, something like insulin. When we do eat some of this glucose up here and we want to get those nutrients to the rest of the body, it's going through the bloodstream, and one of the hormones that we use in the bloodstream and getting the glucose into the cells is insulin. So that's one example. We also have different like thyroid hormones that we're going to be bringing throughout the system. So various hormones, other ones that we've already talked about as well, like parathyroid hormone, when we were talking about the skeletal system, also calcitriol, and calcitonin. So we're moving different hormones throughout the bloodstream and getting them to where they need to go. So that's the things that we're going to be delivering in the body. We're also going to be removing things via the bloodstream. So we'll be removing things like carbon dioxide. So taking carbon dioxide from the tissues, and then we're going to be bringing that to the lungs in order to breathe it out, to get it out of the body. Also, things that we'll be removing are things like heat. So our cardiovascular system, the blood and the blood vessels are going to be working to remove heat from the system if needed, or to maintain heat. In this case, we're talking about removal of something. So to remove heat, if when our body is getting very, very high in temperature, one of the ways through homeostasis, through our negative feedback system, is that we'll bring our blood vessels closer to the surface of our skin and then allow that heat to be removed. And then other waste products. So as our body is going through and we're metabolizing, we're breaking things down, building things up, we're going to have various waste products. So you can think of things like urea, uric acid, things like that, that some of these things are going to be lost in the urine, but there are other different types of waste that we'll talk about that will be removed, but going through the bloodstream and then will be removed from the body. Also, our blood and our cardiovascular system as a whole is going to carry white blood cells and antibodies. And this is for our defense. So our white blood cells are going to be going around and going to be gobbling up things like bacteria and trying to get rid of cells that are infected with viruses. And then also our antibodies do a similar thing where they're trying to attach to different things that are not self, like bacteria or viruses, attach to those things and then warn our immune system or warn our body that there are bad guys in there and we want to get rid of them. And so one of the ways that our body does this is in the bloodstream. So these are kind of our three-ish functions of our cardiovascular system. There's some sub-points in here. So part, delivering oxygen, delivering nutrients, delivering hormones, but then removing things like carbon dioxide, heat, and waste products, and then carrying the white blood cells and antibodies around. So our defensive part of the cardiovascular system. So as we're breaking this down into the heart, the blood vessels, and then also the blood, we want to take a look at the heart first. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at where the heart is located. And so where we find the heart is in the thorax. So remember, the thorax is kind of the chest region. So we have the thorax, and it's between the lungs. You can see in this image here, that is here is the heart, and then this is the right lung, this is the left lung here. So between the lungs in the inferior mediastinum, so remember the mediastinum is this central area in the chest or in the thorax. It's between the third and the sixth ribs. And it is slightly to the left. You can see here that if we kind of draw some lines in here, maybe I'll do it this way. If we were to say this is the center here, you can see that there's a little bit more on the left here than there is on the right. So it is slightly to the left, and what's to the left is this apex of the heart, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So when we're looking here, we can see the lungs, the mediastinum, you can see the heart, and then we're going to talk about the blood vessels that are coming off of the top of the heart here as well, and some of the other pieces. So back to the apex of the heart. So the orientation of the heart is that this bottom part here, the kind of pointy part of the heart, is called the apex, or the apex of the heart, and that's pointed toward the left and down, so kind of toward the left hip, pointing in that direction. And then the base is up here, kind of pointing up toward the right shoulder. Sometimes people talk about it like an ice cream cone, with ice cream on top. And so down here, the pointy part is the apex. And then this top part is the base. So we have our ice cream cone heart here, and then down here is the apex, and up here is the base. And the heart is about the size of a human fist. So whatever size that human happens to be, that's about the size of their heart. So you can see here in this image, the main image that we're looking at is a frontal view here. And you can see the lungs and the heart, but then up here we're looking at the sagittal view in the upper right-hand corner. And so you can see the heart here. You can see here is our mediastinum, and then here is the spine, our vertebrae, and you can see that this here is the heart. And then we have the vessels going up, and we'll talk about the different vessels coming out from the side as well. But you can see this is where our heart is placed. And then one major kind of milestone here is the diaphragm. You can see the diaphragm here, and the heart sits just above the diaphragm. You can see the diaphragm down here as well. So when we are talking about the heart, let's first take a closer look at the actual structure of the heart tissue. So let's take a look at the heart tissue. We'll go over here for a moment. And if we look at the heart tissue, what we're really talking about are the walls of the heart. So we have different chambers. We have different chambers. And they're empty chambers generally, they're filled with blood, but we have these hollow chambers that we'll talk about. And so then what we end up having are walls. And so if we take a look at the wall of a heart, if we took the heart, we kind of took a slice. What we would see is if this is deep and this is superficial, our first layer, this layer right here, our deepest layer, this is the part of the chamber that we'll be talking about where we have it touching the blood. So we're going to say that the blood would be in here, and then this is our first tissue layer. That first tissue layer is called the endocardium. Endo meaning inside, so it's the most inside or the deepest layer, the endocardium. It's a very, very thin layer of tissue, the endocardium. Then the next, and it's very, very smooth. So it's a thin layer of our simple squamous tissue, and it's very, very smooth to allow the blood to flow seamlessly across it, nice and slippery surface. Then we have our largest section here. Let's go from here. So that's our endocardium, and then we'll go to about here. This is our thickest layer, and this layer is our myocardium. So cardium, as it relates to the heart in both of these, cardium, endo meaning inside, heart, and then myo is related to muscle, the myocardium. And so the myocardium is tissue that's composed of cardiac muscle, and this cardiac muscle is called, what they're called are cardiocytes. And these are the cells. So the cardiocytes or the myocardiocytes. So our cardiac muscle, you can see if this is our entire cross-section of the tissue, it's the largest section, takes up the most space. Here's the myocardium, our cardiac muscle. And so we'll talk a little bit about the cardiocytes and the myocardiocytes. So when we take a look at our muscular tissue, if you look at our cardiac muscle, what we see, if we were to take a kind of a close-up look, is we have these cells that are similar to our muscular system cells, but a bit different, and we'll see that here. So what I'm drawing are several of these cells. So this would be one cardiocyte here. One cardiocyte here, and this is another cardiocyte. And what I've drawn between them right here is something that's very specific to cardiac muscle, and that's called an intercalated disc. Now this intercalated disc is very important to cardiac tissue. What this does is it allows these adjacent cardiocytes to share cytoplasm, so it can actually go between the two of them, so it can share cytoplasm, but also remember that cardiac tissue is excitable. Let me write that down here. So it's excitable, and remember what excitable means. That means that it actually experiences and goes through action potentials. So it can carry an electrical charge, and that's important, of course, because we need our heart to pump. So it has to have this electrical conduction going through it in order for all of these cells to contract and to pump the blood out of the heart and into the blood vessels. And so these intercalated discs are actually connections between one cardiocyte and the other cardiocyte that allow things to move through them. One of the important things that is able to move through them are these action potentials. So rather than one cell having to then send neurotransmitters to the next cell that then have a receptor, and then we have these, sodium, potassium pumps, et cetera, which would take a lot of time, instead we have intercalated discs, which are connections between these cardiocytes that allow that action potential to move seamlessly throughout the heart tissue. So all of these are going to experience the action potential. So this allows the top part of the heart, which we'll talk about, the atria, to act like one big structure. So all having this action potential at the same time, essentially, because it moves so quickly, and then contracting. And then the bottom part of the heart, the ventricles, which we'll talk about, to act like one structure as well, where that message, that action potential will be sent throughout the tissue very, very quickly throughout all of the cells to contract all at the same time. So that's a little bit about our cardiocytes. If we move back up here to our walls of the heart, remember our innermost layer is the endocardium, very smooth, allows blood to slide by it. And then we have our myocardium, which we were just talking about, very important. It's going to be the contractor of the heart. Then our next layer, right here, is going to be our epicardium. So again, cardium as it's related to the heart, and epi is surrounding. So the epicardium is also called our visceral pericardium. So maybe that's familiar to you from the beginning of the semester. So the epicardium is surrounding the heart, or the visceral pericardium. So then we have this nice smooth outer layer here. So the epicardium is also smooth, similar to the endocardium, so that we have the ability for the heart muscle to be moving and sliding rather than causing friction with what's around it. Another way that we make sure that we don't have friction and destroying all of the tissue is, remember, we have this space here. Anybody remember what this space was called? Pericardial cavity, right? So we've got fluid in here, the pericardial cavity, so that as our heart is pumping, as it's moving, we have these things that are nice and smooth, our endocardium, our epicardium, our very smooth surfaces. We have the pericardial cavity, which is filled with fluid that's allowing this movement to occur without bumping into other stuff and causing damage. Then after that, the next layer that we have here is our pericardial layer. Our pericardial layer of our serous pericardium. Just like we had our visceral pericardium, our visceral layer of the serous pericardium. And then, on the outside of that, going back to black here, our final layer right here is our fibrous layer. So our fibrous pericardium. And our fibrous pericardium, as its name implies, so our pericardial layer here, the serous pericardium, again, is another smooth layer on the other side of our pericardial cavity to allow this water, or not water, but the solution in the pericardial cavity, the fluid, to kind of move by it very easily to allow for movement. And then our outermost layer, the fibrous pericardium, is going to be our tough outer layer. So this is going to be something where if something were to puncture the chest near the heart, hopefully this fibrous pericardium would be thick enough to where the heart would not be damaged. So it's a nice thick layer to protect the heart. All right, so let's move on to take a look at the anatomy of the heart here now. So if we take the heart and we do a frontal cross section here, this is what we're going to be taking a look at. So if we do a kind of a frontal cross section, it's kind of oblique because of the way that the heart is positioned in the chest. But here is what we're taking a look at with all of our various anatomy parts here, all of our different sections. So if we're looking at the heart, in this image, for whatever reason, there's not much of a point here, but I would say that this is the apex here. For some reason, it's a little bit more rounded. But if we're taking a look at it, let's take a look at all of the different parts of the heart. We'll start at the top here with the right atrium. So the right atrium is this section here, going behind these vessels, which is why, you can't really see part of it. So this is a chamber. So it's a hollowed out section, hollowed out area. This is a receiving chamber. So we have 4 chambers total in the heart. I could probably write that down. So 4 chambers. The top 2 are called atria. That's plural. Atrium is singular. And then the bottom 2, we can write top, and the bottom 2 are called the ventricles. All right. And then our atria are the right atria and the left atria, and our ventricles are the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So here, again, if we look at the image, we can see our right atrium at the top, and then over here, we have our left atrium. So again, when we're looking at the image, this is the left side of the body over here and the right side of the body over here. So left atrium, right atrium, and then if we look at the bottom half of the heart here, then we have our right ventricle here, and then our left ventricle over here. So our top two chambers are atria, the bottom two are the ventricles. The top two are receiving chambers, and they're separated by what is actually difficult to see here in this image because we have these vessels here and here, which are in front of it. But if we were to remove those vessels between the two atria, we have what's called the interatrial septum. So interatrial septum. Inter meaning between, and atrial, so between the atria, and then septum. And this is just basically the tissue that separates the two atria. Then if we look at the bottom, we have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. These are discharging chambers. So this is where the blood is going to be forced out of to go to the body, whether or not we're talking about the lungs or the system, which is the rest of the body. Between these two, this big, thick piece of tissue that you can actually see here, this is called the interventricular septum. So again, inter, between, and then ventricular, so between the ventricles, septum. So we have our atria, we have our septums, interatrial septum and interventricular septum. Then if we look at the vessels, some of the important vessels here, we call them the great vessels. If we look at the great vessels, what we're talking about, first of all, we're talking about the aorta. You can see here, specifically this part is called the arch of the aorta. We have an ascending aorta, and then if we continue down, we have a descending aorta, etc. But this large structure here, this large vessel is called the aorta. The aorta is going to be bringing blood out of our left ventricle. So our aorta is our number one great vessel, bringing blood out of the left ventricle to go to the system. Our next great vessel is the pulmonary trunk. So the pulmonary trunk here, this is our giant blue one right here. So the pulmonary trunk is where we have blood coming out of the right ventricle and going into this pulmonary trunk. So it's going to be carrying blood or bringing blood out of the right ventricle. And that is then going to be going into the lungs. So pulmonary trunk. The term pulmonary implies lungs. So remember, pulmonary is lungs. Then we also have our vena cava. There are two, sort of. It's actually all one vessel, but we've separated it into inferior vena cava and superior vena cava. Inferior, of course, meaning below. It actually comes from below the heart and brings blood up to the right atrium. And then the superior vena cava here is bringing blood from above or superior to the heart into the right atrium. And then lastly, so that's third, our vena cava. And then our pulmonary veins, we can see we have our left pulmonary veins right here. So our left pulmonary veins that are going to be bringing blood to the left atrium. And then back here behind the right atrium, then we would have right pulmonary veins as well that you can't see. They're behind the image. They would be way back here. We also have two right pulmonary veins that are then still going to be bringing blood into our left atrium. All right, so that would be 4, the pulmonary veins. So pulmonary, again, meaning the lungs. So they're actually bringing the blood from the lungs into the left atrium. So the next part I'd like to talk about, I erased this here so that we could take a look at the last piece of the anatomy of the heart that we want to see here. So and it's actually kind of two things. We're going to be taking a look at the valves of the heart. Now there are two different types of valves. So 2 types, but 4 valves total. So the 2 different types are, the first one are the atrioventricular valves, AV valves. So the atrioventricular valves, or for short, the AV valves, these, as the name implies, are between the atria and the ventricles. So the atria and the ventricle. And so our atrioventricular valves, there are two. The first one that we'll take a look at is the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is on the right side of the heart. You might be able to remember this because it has the R. Tri is for the right. Tricuspid valve is in the right side of the heart. So it would be between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And you can actually see this right here. The tricuspid valve is this valve here. And so the function of the valves is to allow blood to flow in only one direction. So these are preventing backflow of blood. We want to make sure we keep the blood going the right direction. So we have the blood coming in through the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava into our right atrium. And then we want it to go from the right atrium down into our right ventricle. And so the tricuspid valve is here to when it's open, it's going to allow blood to flow from the right atrium down into the right ventricle. But then when we are going to be pumping the blood out of the right ventricle into our pulmonary trunk, we want that valve to be closed so that the blood doesn't go back up into the right atrium, so that it's forced out of the pulmonary trunk. The second one that we see is called the bicuspid valve, also sometimes called the mitral valve. And so then this is on the left side of the heart. And you can see the mitral valve as it's labeled here. I prefer bicuspid because it actually tells me a little bit more information about the valve, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So we have here our pulmonary veins. Remember, there are left pulmonary veins on the left side, but then behind the heart here, there are also right pulmonary veins. And they are going to be carrying blood from the lungs into our left atrium. Then once that goes into the left atrium, we want it to drain down into our left ventricle. So the valve here, you can actually see this one a little bit better. This valve is actually open. And then you can see that blood would be trickling in here into our left ventricle. But then, just like we saw on the right side, when we want the blood to be pumped out of the left ventricle and into the aorta, then we want this valve to be closed so that the blood does not go back up into the left atrium. So we have our tricuspid valve on the right side and the bicuspid valve on the left side. The reason I use bicuspid instead of mitral valve is because of their name, tri meaning three and cuspid meaning cusps. And what that means is that if we look at the valves themselves, so there's the opening of the valve, but the tricuspid has three flaps of tissue. So that's two, so that's 1, 2, and then there's a third flap of tissue back here. So the tricuspid has three flaps of tissue, and that's why it's called the tricuspid. Those flaps of tissue are called cusps. So tricuspid has three, and that's on the right side of the heart. And then over here, the bicuspid, and you can actually see, so this is one flap of tissue here, and then this is the second flap of tissue here, and then they're attached by these strings called Chordae Tendineae. So our cusps, our flaps here, the bicuspid meaning 2, the tricuspid meaning 3, and then we have the Chordae Tendineae that are holding those cusps and attaching them to the inside of the heart here, attaching them to that endocardium that's lining the entire inside of the heart here. So our Chordae Tendineae, also known as heartstrings. Those are going to be pulling along with our papillary muscles. Our papillary muscles and our Chordae Tendineae are going to be pulling on these cusps in order to make sure that they stay open to allow blood to be flowing through them, and then they will relax so that when the blood is going to be forced out of the ventricles into either the pulmonary trunk on the right side or the aorta on the left side, the papillary muscles will relax, not pull on these heartstrings, not pull on the Chordae Tendineae, and then allow these cusps to fold up and not allow the blood, to backflow into the atrium. We also have some muscles inside of our ventricles that are called trabeculae carnae. These you can see down here. These are going to be assisting in the contraction and assisting in getting the blood out of those areas. The second set of valves that we have. Let me go ahead and erase my little cusp drawing here. So the second set of valves, so the first were the atrioventricular valves that we just talked about. The second are the semilunar valves. So the semilunar valves, we have two of them, and they are between the ventricle and the artery. So let me kind of erase some of this stuff here. Between the ventricle and the artery now. So we looked at those that are between the atrioventricular, the atrium and the ventricle. Now we're looking at the ventricle, so we'll start here on the right side, between the right ventricle and our pulmonary trunk, the vessel up here. You can see this one is called our pulmonary semilunar valve. So pulmonary semilunar valve is on the right side. So this is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. You can see it right here. On the left side, we have the aortic semilunar valve. And you can see that here. So they shortened it here to pulmonary valve and aortic valve. It's the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve. And you can see that here between our left ventricle and up here, our aorta. And so again, this is going to prevent the backflow of blood. And so when we are going to be pumping the blood out of the left ventricle or pumping blood out of the right ventricle, we are forcing the blood in this direction. And when we force it in that direction, these are semilunar valves, meaning that they have these little flaps of tissue here. They kind of look like moons, semilunar. They are going to push open and allow the blood to go out into the pulmonary trunk. This one will push open, allow the blood to go into the aorta. And then when that contraction is done, when the ventricles are no longer contracting and forcing blood out of them, then they're going to relax, and then these valves will be closed. So they kind of relax, and then these cusps, these flaps of tissue are going to settle down and be closed again. And then that is going to allow any blood that was in here to kind of pool up in this area and then keep this closed until the next contraction comes to force the blood out again. So this kind of wraps up the anatomy of the heart, so it's where it's located in the chest, as well as the different parts of the heart. We also talked about the kind of microscopic anatomy when we're talking about the myocardium, and various other layers, and also the functions of the cardiovascular system. So next we'll take a look at some more details and how the blood is going through the heart.